Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going way back to ancient Greece to explore the world of ancient philosophy.
We're going deep with you. Think of us as your guides as we unpack excerpts from Anthony Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy, Ancient Philosophy.
Yeah, Kenny really gets into the nitty-gritty of how these philosophical ideas developed.
And it's a long history.
It is a long history. Our mission today is to give you a solid understanding of the major players and their ideas, especially the ones that are still relevant today, even after all these centuries.
You might be surprised how much of our modern thinking is rooted in these ancient ideas.
It's wild, right? So Kenny starts by pointing out that even before what we traditionally call philosophy, there were already people asking the big questions, but it wasn't quite as clear-cut as it is now. It was more of a blend of religion, science, and early philosophical thought all mixed together.
That's a really important point. These early thinkers like Thales weren't bound by the strict categories we use today. He was as much about measuring pyramids and predicting eclipses as he was about figuring out the archa, the fundamental principle of reality.
Wait, he was measuring pyramids?
Yeah.
So he wasn't just sitting around thinking deep thoughts.
Exactly. He was a hands-on kind of philosopher. He famously said, water is the first principle. Pretty down to earth, right?
Yeah.
But then he also said, all things are full of gods, which throws a whole mystical element into the mix.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. It's like he was trying to bridge these two worlds, the material and the mystical.
And that's what makes these early thinkers so fascinating. They were searching for a holistic understanding of the universe.
And let's not forget that hilarious story about Thales falling into a well while staring up at the stars. It's like this perfect metaphor for the blend of practicality and head in the clouds, thinking that was going on back then.
That story really captures their spirit, doesn't it? It reminds us that even the most brilliant minds can get caught up in their own thoughts.
So we've got these early thinkers trying to figure out the universe, and then we come to Pythagoras. What's the big shift with him?
Pythagoras and his followers brought something completely new to the table: mathematics. They started using math as a primary tool for understanding the cosmos. Imagine the impact of that.
So before Pythagoras, it was all about observing and wondering, but with him, things got a lot more structured.
Absolutely. Suddenly, it wasn't just about random elements. Pythagoras saw order and patterns in the universe, and math was the key to unlocking those patterns. And that idea that the universe is fundamentally mathematical is still incredibly powerful today.
It makes you look at the world differently, doesn't it? It's like everything has an underlying logic.
But we can't forget the other side of Pythagoras, the mystical side. His ideas about the transmigration of souls, the focus on music and numbers, these ideas were hugely influential, especially for Plato.
Speaking of Plato, he's kind of a big deal, right? The towering figure in ancient philosophy. But to really get him, we need some context.
Picture this. Plato, an Athenian aristocrat, totally disillusioned with politics after his teacher, Socrates, was executed, he decides to found the academy, which becomes this incredible intellectual hub for centuries.
Okay, so we've got the setting, but what's the big idea that makes Plato so impactful? What's the thing he's known for?
It's the theory of forms. Imagine a realm of perfect, unchanging blueprints forms. Think of a perfect circle, a perfect concept of justice. These forms exist outside of our everyday world.
Okay, I'm following so far. But where do we fit into all of this?
Well, Plato believed that our world, the one we experience with our senses, is just a shadow of that perfect realm of forms. Everything we see is just an imperfect copy of the true ideal form.
Whoa, that's a pretty mind-blowing concept. So everything around us is just an imitation.
Exactly. And that's why this idea is so significant. It completely changes how we think about truth, knowledge, and reality itself.
I can see how that would shake things up. So is Plato saying that we can never really know anything for sure, since we're only seeing these imperfect copies?
That's a question that Plato himself grappled with. He was trying to reconcile the idea of Parmenides, who believed in an unchanging reality, with the idea of Heraclitus, who saw the world as in constant flux. So Plato split the difference. He assigned the unchanging reality to the forms, and the constant change to the world of our senses.
Okay, so two separate realities, each following its own rules. But doesn't that create some problems? I mean, how do these two realities interact?
You're catching on. It does get messy. In fact, in dialogues like the Parmenides, Plato actually seems to critique his own theory of forms. He raises questions about whether it all really holds together. And in the Sophist, he starts to move towards a more dynamic idea of reality, trying to solve some of those problems.
So even Plato was willing to admit he might not have all the answers. That's actually pretty refreshing.
It shows that philosophy is a process, not a destination. It's about asking questions, exploring different possibilities,
Yeah.
and being willing to revise your thinking as you go.
That's a great point. So we've got Plato wrestling with these big ideas. And then comes his star student, Aristotle. He spent 20 years at the academy, soaking it all in.
But he ends up breaking away from Plato in some pretty significant ways. Aristotle is less interested in those otherworldly forms and much more interested in observing the natural world directly. He's all about biology, logic, ethics grounded in everyday life.
So if Plato's forms are up there somewhere, abstract and perfect, where does Aristotle put form?
For Aristotle, the form is in the thing itself. It's not separate. Think of it like this. An acorn contains within it the potential to become an oak tree. The form of the oak tree is already present in the acorn.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like the form is the blueprint, but it's not floating around in some abstract realm. It's right here in the physical world.
And that shift in thinking changes everything. Aristotle's focus on categories, causes, logic. These ideas become the foundation of Western thought for centuries. It's hard to overstate his influence.
Okay, so we've got these giants, Plato and Aristotle, laying the groundwork, but it doesn't stop there. They each inspire different schools of thought, different philosophical teams, if you will, that grapple with the big questions in their own way.
It's fascinating how this one period in ancient Greece sparked such a diverse range of philosophical ideas. We see schools like Epicureanism, Stoicism, and skepticism emerging, all trying to figure out how to live a good life in a world that can often feel chaotic and uncertain.
It makes you wonder if those times were really so different from our own. We're still asking the same questions about happiness, meaning, and how to deal with all the ups and downs life throws at us.
Absolutely. And exploring how these ancient schools approach these questions can give us some valuable insights for navigating our own lives. Let's start with Epicureanism. You mentioned earlier that they were about pleasure, but not in a superficial party all the time kind of way.
Right. It sounded a bit more nuanced than that.
Exactly. For Epicurus, pleasure was the ultimate good, the path to happiness. But he distinguished between different types of pleasure. There were the fleeting, intense pleasures that come from satisfying basic needs like hunger or thirst. And then there were the calmer, more enduring pleasures. That came from a tranquil state of mind.
So it's not about chasing fleeting highs, but cultivating a kind of inner peace.
Precisely. Epicurus believed that true happiness came from freedom from pain, both physical and mental. And he thought that the biggest source of mental pain was fear, particularly the fear of death.
That makes a lot of sense. Death was a much more constant presence back then, wasn't it? Not something that was often hidden away like it is today.
Exactly. And to address this fear, Epicurus turned to atomism. That's the idea that the universe is made up of these tiny, indivisible particles called atoms, constantly moving around in a void.
So no soul, no afterlife, just atoms rearranging themselves. Did that make death less scary for them?
For Epicurus, it was liberating. Death was simply the dissolution of those soul atoms. Nothing to be feared. No judgment. No underworld. Just a peaceful end to existence.
Wow, that's a radically different way of thinking about death than what many people believe today.
It is, and it really highlights the Epicurean focus on living in the present, enjoying simple pleasures, and cultivating inner peace. It's about freeing yourself from the anxieties that weigh you down.
I can see how that would be appealing, especially in a world that felt turbulent and unpredictable. Okay, so we have the Epicureans seeking tranquility, but the Stoics, they seem to take a different approach, right? They almost sound a bit more intense.
You could say that. While the Epicureans focused on minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure, the Stoics believed that virtue was the only true good. It was the key to happiness.
So it's about living a moral life, doing the right thing, no matter what.
Yes, that's a big part of it. They also believed in living in accordance with nature, which they saw as rationally ordered. This meant accepting the things you couldn't control, like illness, loss, or even death, and focusing on what you could control, your own thoughts and actions.
Okay, I'm not sure I get that. How can you just accept things like illness or loss? Those are pretty big deals.
For the Stoics, it was about understanding that the universe is governed by this divine logos, a rational principle that permeates everything. To live in harmony with nature meant aligning your will with this cosmic order.
So it's like surrendering to a bigger plan.
In a way, yes. It's about recognizing that there are things beyond our control, and that struggling against them only creates unnecessary suffering. The key is to focus on what we can control, which is our own response to those events.
But wouldn't that lead to a pretty passive life, just accepting whatever happens without trying to change things?
Not necessarily. The Stoics didn't advocate for inaction. They recognized that we have a duty to act in the world. But they emphasized that we should act with wisdom and virtue, guided by reason rather than being controlled by our emotions.
So it's about controlling your emotions, not letting them run wild.
Yes, that's a big part of Stoicism. They believed that emotions like anger, fear, and grief were often irrational and harmful. They could cloud our judgment and lead us to make bad decisions.
So how do you do that? Just shut off your emotions? That sounds pretty hard.
It's not about suppressing emotions entirely. It's more about cultivating a state of inner peace, or apatheia, that allows you to face any challenge with equanimity. It's about recognizing that emotions are often fleeting and unreliable, and that true happiness comes from living virtuously, regardless of external circumstances.
Okay, I can start to see how that could be a powerful way to live, but wouldn't it take a lot of practice to reach that level of detachment?
Definitely. But the Stoics believed that through reason and self-discipline, you could train yourself to respond to even the most difficult situations with wisdom and courage. It's about choosing how you react, rather than letting your emotions dictate your actions.
So it's about taking responsibility for your own inner state, no matter what's happening around you. That's pretty challenging, but also kind of inspiring.
It is, and it's a philosophy that continues to resonate with people today, especially in times of uncertainty and hardship.
Okay, so we've got the pleasure-seeking Epicureans and the virtue-focused Stoics. But what about the skeptics? Where do they fit into all of this? They sound like they'd be a fun group to hang out with, always questioning everything.
The skeptics definitely take a more radical approach. They question the very possibility of certain knowledge. They argue that our senses can deceive us, our reasoning can be flawed, and we can never be absolutely sure of anything.
So they're the ultimate doubters, always playing devil's advocate.
In a way, yes. But it's not about being contrary or argumentative for the sake of it. Their goal is to achieve a state of ataraxia, a kind of tranquil detachment from the anxieties of trying to find certainty where it may not exist.
So instead of stressing about finding the right answer, they focus on finding peace in the unknown.
Exactly. They argue that by suspending judgment, by not clinging to beliefs that might be false, we can achieve a state of mental calmness and freedom.
I can see the appeal of that, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with so much information and so many conflicting opinions.
It's a valuable reminder that sometimes the wisest course of action is to simply acknowledge what we don't know. It's about embracing uncertainty rather than fighting against it.
But this raises a big question for me. If we can't be certain of anything, how do we make decisions? How do we navigate life without some kind of knowledge or belief system to guide us?
It's a great question, and one that the skeptics themselves wrestled with. They had some interesting answers which we'll explore when we dive deeper into the practical implications of skepticism in our next segment.
So we left off with this big question about skepticism. How can you live a normal life if you're constantly questioning everything?
It's easy to picture a skeptic as someone who's completely paralyzed by indecision, unable to do anything because they can't be certain about the outcome.
Right, like how do you even choose what to eat for breakfast if you're not sure what food really is?
That's where it's important to remember that skepticism isn't about denying reality. It's not about saying the world we experience isn't real.
So it's more about acknowledging that our perception of reality might not be completely accurate.
Exactly. We still rely on our senses to navigate the world. And skeptics would say it's perfectly reasonable to act based on how things appear to us.
Okay, so even if I can't be 100% certain that this chair is solid, I can still go ahead and sit in it.
Precisely. The skeptics called this reasonable belief. You don't need absolute certainty to function in the world.
So it's like saying, look, I see a chair, it seems sturdy enough, so I'm going to sit down. No need to overthink it.
Right. They emphasize living in accordance with the everyday, relying on customs, traditions, and what seems practically sound.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like saying you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you leave the house.
It's about finding that middle ground between blind faith and paralyzing doubt, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge while still being able to live a meaningful life.
I'm starting to see how skepticism can actually be quite freeing. It's like taking the pressure off of having to have all the answers.
It's about accepting that uncertainty is a fundamental part of the human experience, and that's okay.
So we've explored these three major schools of thought that emerged from ancient Greece: Epicureanism, Stoicism, and skepticism. It's amazing how much they still resonate with us today.
And what's really fascinating is how intertwined these ideas were. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle were building on the work of their predecessors, arguing with them, refining their ideas, and sometimes even turning them completely upside down.
It's like this incredible conversation spanning centuries, with each generation adding their own unique perspective.
And that's what's so exciting about studying ancient philosophy. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about engaging in this grand dialogue about the big questions that humans have been grappling with for millennia.
And Kenny does a brilliant job of bringing that dialogue to life. He shows how these thinkers, even when they disagreed vehemently, were united by this shared passion for seeking wisdom.
And that's a pursuit that's just as relevant in the 21st century as it was back in ancient Greece.
Before we wrap up, let's give our listeners something to ponder, something that builds on what we've discussed today.
We've seen how these ancient thinkers wrestled with questions about knowledge, reality, and the good life. Their answers were diverse, but their shared commitment to the pursuit of wisdom is what continues to inspire us. So here's a question for you. What does the good life mean to you in our modern world? How would Plato, Aristotle, or any of the thinkers we've discussed today answer that question if they were living among us now?
That's a fantastic question to leave our listener with. It's a reminder that the ideas of ancient philosophy aren't just relics of the past. They're tools for thinking about our own lives, our own values, and our place in the universe.
We hope this deep dive into ancient philosophy has given you a new appreciation for these timeless ideas, and maybe even sparked your own philosophical journey.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another deep exploration of a fascinating topic. Until then, keep those philosophical wheels turning.